So we're standing in a line with hundreds of people either side of me, and we get this call on the radio that says that there's a superpod of 200 whales heading straight towards you. And they just said, we can't stop them. They're heading straight into the bay. Be prepared. Farewell Spit is one of 3 what's called whale traps. It's perfectly built for catching whales out. The topography, the sand is really porous, and the echolocation doesn't work as well as it would if it was a steep cliff. On top of that, there's also huge tidal zones. So the tide can come in and out in areas of 10 to 12 kilometers. So we've got a huge body of water moving every 6 hours. So by the time the whales figure out that they're running out of water, often they don't have time to turn around and swim back out to sea, and they do end up getting trapped. In 2017, in February, we received a phone call about 10 p.m. at night from someone who had been walking out on the spit and came across some stranded whales. We mobilized what we call our local volunteers or our local medics and asked them to be there at first light. What met our volunteers that morning was a chaotic, horrific scene of hundreds of whales dead, but still about 100 whales alive in amongst the dead whales. Even with as many people as we could get there at first light, we were just outnumbered by whales. Pilot whales, they don't strand beautifully and spaced out along the beach. They'll get as close to each other as they can, so that you often have to weave your way in around different whales. And the tail of a whale is incredibly dangerous. If the whale decides to move or is stressed, it can come up really quickly, and it has a lot of force in it. So it's really important that people are mindful where they place themselves when they're looking after these whales. What happens when they're out on the beach, particularly in summer, is that they can overheat really quickly and get quite sick and perhaps pass away as a result of overheating. And so it's really important that we try and keep them as cool as we can until they're returned out to the water. We'll pour buckets of water over them to keep them nice and cool. We'll also place light-coloured sheets over their backs just to reflect some of that sunlight and to retain some of that water, because we're working out in really exposed beaches. There's no trees, there's no shade, because the tide does go out about 10 kilometers. If you wanted to fill up some buckets, it would be a 20k round trip. So we have to work with what we've got available, which is very limited water. So we will dig holes around the whales and just reuse the water that we have to keep them cool and to keep them comfortable until that tide does start to come in. When it came time to have water around the animals, we had over 500 people on site. These animals live in the water. They love being in the water. It's their natural environment. So when they start to feel water around them, they start to almost wake up a bit, and they start moving their muscles and wanting to be out in the deeper water. And it can be quite a dangerous time for people. And the whales are trying to move, but they're still stuck. So the tails are coming up quite a lot. Now, pilot whales are incredibly social, and so it's really important when we look after them and when we refloat them that we give them time to socialize, to come together as a pod. They're probably trying to figure out what's going on, who's made it, who hasn't made it, do they feel like swimming off? I don't know what they're saying, but if you stick your head under the water, you can hear so much sound and like an orchestra of noise. And we see from their body language as they rub up against each other and as they swim in tight circles that they are regrouping and figuring out what happens next. We will stand hand in hand and form a human chain between the deeper water and the beach. And the reason we do this is so we don't want the pilot whales swimming back onto the beach. They're quite disorientated. They've been on a hard surface, which they've never been on in their life. So we're standing in a line with hundreds of people either side of me. And we get this call on the radio that says, there's a superpod of 200 whales heading straight towards you. And they just said, we can't stop them. They're heading straight into the bay. Be prepared. And suddenly we're looking up, trying to see them in the horizon, and we just see this turbulent water moving closer and closer. And as we watched the pod, we were deciding at what point we're going to get everybody back onto the beach. And the superpod, as we call it, came in closer and started to slow down. And what happened next was extraordinary. This superpod, which couldn't be stopped by boats, swam into the bay and picked up this pod of 100 that we had been looking after that morning. And then everybody swam off together off into the distance. And those of us in the human chain were open mouthed. Now we had no whales in front of us. So everybody celebrated and just tried to wrap their mind around what had happened as we headed back to the beach. People started to trickle away. They started to head home. It had been a very long day, particularly for those who had been there at first light. And then 5 o'clock, we got the call that we had been dreading. 200 whales restranded at 5 o'clock that night, and there was nothing we could do to prevent these whales from restranding. They just swam straight into shore. All that we could do is hold them upright. By stranding them upright, we were able to give them the best possible chance of surviving overnight. And so we cared for them as long as we could, and then at last light, we took everybody off the beach. We don't work with the whales overnight. It's an incredibly remote location. They're dark animals, there's no light. And we do know that night brings out a lot of nocturnal animals such as sharks. We just prayed and waited until the sun came up the next morning. At very first light, or even pre-dawn, we get our trucks onto the beach. Overnight, 183 whales managed to refloat themselves on the incoming tide, and there are 17 whales found. But for all that we could see, they were in healthy, good condition, and so we looked after them until the tide, which was about midday, and refloated them, and they swam off. And after that, there was no further sightings of any whales. It was a huge event. It was the third largest stranding in New Zealand's history. So we're looking at an event that had over 600 whales involved over 2 and a bit days. For me, when I look back, it's not about numbers. Often on the news or in media footage, it's the people on the beach with the whales that get a lot of attention. But for us who have been there, the heroes also include the local community. We have people volunteering to guide cars, to park cars, to give briefings, to be there as emotional support people for when people come off the beach, to shoulder tap people and remind them to take a drink. Whale strandings are a community response. Project Jonah is 2 people, 2 staff, and we've got 4,500 volunteers who have done our training. But when it comes to such a massive event, it's a huge community response, and it comes down to people wanting to help. As long as people are willing to help, I have hope for the future. I have hope that as a humankind, we'll continue to help as best and where we can.